Okay. I'm recording this on the same day I record the intro and outro for my interview with Laurel Beversdorf. So you'll be happy to know the weather is still nice and sunny. And I'm recording this around 5:30 in the evening, and I still have plenty of sunlight, which is incredible to think that just a few weeks ago it would have been pitch black out before 4 o'clock. And now suddenly we have our nice golden Scottish evenings back. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. Today's interview is with Dr. Sarah Court, DPT. So Sarah is a physiotherapist, and she is the business partner of Laurel Beversdorf, who I also interviewed recently. And together they make up Movement Logic, which is a company, if you've heard the previous interview, that really helps to clarify a lot of the misunderstandings and myths around strength training, especially as it pertains to women, especially as it pertains to women in their middle years as they get older and maybe start confronting some of the fears around a menopause and osteoporosis and osteopenia. But also the advice that Sarah gives is really applicable to everybody. I think this is a really great interview. If I do say so myself. I think the two are really complementary. In this one, we talk a lot about critical thinking. We talk a lot about identifying grifters or identifying scammers, or even just identifying people who sometimes get trapped in social media land where there are perverse incentives that sort of help people make claims they perhaps shouldn't be making, especially if it pertains to selling supplements and things like that. So one of the reasons I really wanted to get Sarah on was she did an episode on her own podcast, Movement Logic, a few weeks ago about the tension between doctors who are also brands. So this doctor brand framework, because it does seem like for some reason on social media recently, especially the last few months, we're seeing more and more doctors who are perhaps making claims that actually they're not qualified to make. And, I will say this is not an anti-doctor podcast. It's really just looking at individuals who happen to be doctors who are also doing things maybe they shouldn't be doing, like making big claims about supplements or working with, sometimes shady companies that convince people to spend money on things that they don't need. So that's a big part of the conversation. We also just talk about different ways that online figures can sometimes wow or bamboozle people with big words and using complex narratives that may or may not be true. So this is really a great episode if you just want to develop some tools for critical thinking. If you hear someone making big claims on the internet and you think, I don't know if I can trust that or not, then listen to this episode and I think it'll help you with that. So I've done enough time talking. So hope you enjoy this episode and I'll catch you on the other end.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
Okay, I am here today with Dr. Sarah Court, physical therapist, and she is one of the members of the company Movement Logic, and they have a great podcast. You've probably seen them on social media. I think that they are one of the real positive forces in messaging around fitness and exercise, especially as it pertains to the advice that's sometimes given to women. And it was Jill who turned me on to Movement Logic, and she's like, "Oh, you have to listen to the podcast." And she was right. I thought the podcast was absolutely excellent. So I've been doing a deep dive, and I just really want to get both Sarah and Laura on. So Laura will be on one of the other episodes, but today we have Dr. Sarah Court. Sarah, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. I'll begin with the question I asked everyone. Who are you and how did you get here?
What are you doing? Who are you? What time is it? I'm Sarah Court. I'm a physical therapist. And I started my career as a yoga teacher for several years, something like 13 years. And I sort of got to a point with that work where I felt like I could do more, but the job would not permit it in terms of scope and things like that. I got to a point where people would be asking me like borderline medical questions. And in my head, I'm like, I mean, I study a lot and I learned a lot of the stuff, but like, I'm not really qualified to answer this question as a yoga teacher. So and later in life, I went back to school and I got my doctorate in physical therapy. And so since, it's almost 10 years. I've been a physical therapist now for about 10 years. And I live in Los Angeles. I have my own private practice here. And then Laurel and I are the co-owners of Movement Logic, and that's all of most of my online presence is Movement Logic related. There's a little bit of things here and there that I do by myself, but for the most part, Laurel and I have our company that we created to, well, for a lot of different reasons actually, but we can get into that in a moment.
Yeah, it's something I didn't ask Laurel, but it's something that both of you are so good about, and I don't really talk about it. I used to help do CSCS courses, so I would always talk about it a lot. But this idea of scope of practice, which I think has often been thrown out, especially in the online fitness world, can you just talk a little bit about this concept of scope of practice? Because I think it is really important, and I often think that people don't even realize that this exists or should exist.
Yeah, I mean, so there's sort of a couple of ways to think about it. One is any sort of what I would call like a non-clinician. So a personal trainer, a yoga teacher, a Pilates instructor, and any of that kind of movement specialist work that's not clinical. There you should have hopefully gotten somewhere in your training a lot of information about what's appropriate for you to talk about and what's not appropriate for you to talk about. Certainly as a yoga teacher, it was made very clear to us, like, we are not diagnosing, we are not treating anything, right? Somebody comes up to you and says, it hurts my back when I do this movement. Really, and this was also what kind of pushed me to become a clinician. The only answer as a yoga teacher that you can really say is, I'm not sure why that's happening. Maybe don't do that movement. Or or maybe suggest, like, try this stretch and see if it feels helpful. But that's kind of like the beginning and end of what you should be saying. We don't always see that. Sometimes we see people reaching beyond the scope of what they're trained to do and making recommendations for, oh, it's you have a disc herniation, or something like that, where there's literally no way they could know that, and even a clinician wouldn't necessarily know that just from someone describing a movement. So that's really important. And um, the biggest difference is I went to school for 3 years to learn how to do what's called differential diagnosis. And that's the ability to take symptoms, to take what the person is reporting and telling you about what they're feeling, and be able to kind of go through the I was going to say the filing cabinet in your mind, which just shows how old I am, and you know include or separate out, it might be this, it might not be this kind of thing. It's also really important for things like really red flag conditions, that if you see certain clusters of symptoms, someone else might not know to say, like, hey, you should probably go to a doctor very soon, like right now, kind of thing. I've had a few experiences like that, or discovering that someone has some other kind of condition going on that nobody had caught at that point. So it's really important. And pretty much nobody pays attention to it. The other thing, so it can be frustrating. The thing that we see online a lot as well is this kind of second part of it that I wanted to talk about, which is you see a lot of medical doctors who have a specialty in a field. Someone like Mary Claire Haver, who's a sort of menopause, she's in what's called the menopause, which is a collection of doctors who, in my opinion, ought to know better. She is trained as a OBGYN, but she is selling nutrition supplements. She is giving exercise advice. She's doing a lot of things where you might say, well, sure, under the umbrella of being a doctor, nothing's really totally out of her scope per se, but it is not her specialty. And it's certainly not, and the manner in which it's being done is certainly not, in my opinion, ethical at all. She's just one example. There's lots of MDs who branch outside of their specialty and suddenly know everything about nutrition and sleep and metabolism and bioavailability and all these kinds of things that are not their scope, or not their specialty, I should say. So scope has really kind of gone out the window in a lot of ways. And that's one of the things that ends up being frustrating about what we see on social media all the time, which is that I shouldn't say nobody, but a lot of people don't seem to care. We see doctors giving advice on topics that are outside their scope, and everyone's like, sounds good to me, kind of thing. So that's Laurel and I bring that up a lot. But that's one of the frustrating things that we see from a lot of, health and wellness influencers, is that they're just suddenly experts in everything.
Yeah, let's go in that direction. I was going to ask you some other questions first, but I think naturally we're always going to get to this point. So, you did a great podcast and also a post on Instagram a few weeks ago, where you were sharing this framework of the doctor brand sort of framework, and it really kind of addresses exactly this. Where Well, I mean, I'll let you explain it yourself, but some of the perverse incentives and what it means to kind of get stuck in the algorithm, try to make money off of it. Can you kind of talk about this Dr. Brand framework, why you think it's important, and maybe give the audience some tips so they can have some critical thinking skills if they see this happening?
Sure, absolutely. Uh, the First of all, that post like blew it did better than anything we've literally ever done. I think it's gotten close to 700,000 views or something crazy. So uh, I was trying to find a way to like coalesce a lot of these different little pieces of behavior into like, this is what it looks like when a doctor is online and behaving like a doctor. And this is what it looks like when a doctor is online and behaving like a brand. And this idea of behaving like a brand just means that they're selling you something, essentially, at the end of the day. And they're protecting their ability to sell you something. So it does sort of go back to this scope of practice as well. But, we've seen with the rise of people taking wellness advice or health advice from people online or people they've never met before, not their own personal doctor who probably knows them or definitely knows them much better than some doctor on social media that they've never met. But we are seeing this sort of rise of it. And so we wanted to really delineate what it looks like when you engage with a doctor online who's behaving like a doctor, and what it looks like when you engage with someone who's behaving like a brand. And there are tells, right? There's certain giveaways. And so that's sort of what we went into in the post. So in terms of things to look out for, um, one very classic thing that happens is if you question a doctor who's behaving like a brand, right? If you write in the comments, hey, I'm not sure that this is accurate or something like that, and Laurel and I have both done this, they will block you and they will delete your comments. Because for them, what's important is that when someone goes to their page and starts scrolling through their posts, it's all in agreement. It's all positive. It's all, yay, this doctor has helped me so much kind of thing. We've also discovered that a lot of, I'm just going to call them grifters because that's what they are. A lot of these doctor grifters have like very rabid followings. And so when we, on our page make posts or content that's pushing back against what these people are saying, we will get attacked by their followers. But the attack is never substantial. It's always things like, why are you being mean? You are jealous of her. This is not very nice. It's attacking the way we're speaking, not the contents of what we're saying, because there is no comeback for the contents of what we're saying when we're pointing out facts, right? So a doctor who's behaving like a brand will suddenly be expert in like every single topic, right? They'll suddenly be telling you about, like we said before, nutrition and sleep and metabolism and supplements and hormones and all these kinds of things that they're not necessarily specialists in. If you question a doctor in the internet space, they will engage with you typically. If you question them in a way that's like, hey, we're just wondering, like, we saw this evidence, what do you think about this, right? But somebody behaving like a brand is not interested in any sort of like nuance or detail because they're selling you a thing, right? A brand is going to say that everybody needs a certain product, right? You have Dr. Vonda Wright, who's another member of this menopause, saying like, here's my protein powder with XYZ products in it. And it's always a bunch of sort of like currently hot things. Like peptides is now the thing that everyone's obsessed with, right? So, but creatine, turmeric, collagen, all of these things that creatine is the only one that actually has some significant evidence behind it. The rest of it really doesn't. A doctor is going to individualize your treatment to you, right? That's why an online doctor is not really your best bet. And the other big thing about a doctor online versus a doctor behaving like a brand online is the science is always changing. We're always updating what we know. We're standing on the shoulders of researchers who have come before us, and we're adding to that, and we're saying, hey, we used to think this, but now we have new research, and it's become obvious that actually it's that, right? Not this. If they're behaving like a brand, they kind of have to ignore any new data that conflicts with their message or what they're selling you, because then they're not going to be able to sell their product anymore, right? If they were really looking at the evidence, like to go back to Mary Claire Haver, she's one of the people that was really gung-ho about like everybody getting a weighted vest. And I live in Los Angeles, people like to hike. 10 years ago, I would see maybe like some really jacked bro dude wearing a weighted vest and like running uphill. And you'd be like, wow, that man's either an athlete or just like really intense or something like that, right? But now everybody and their mother has one, and they're just kind of like taking their nice casual stroll. But the evidence that is being cited for wearing a weighted vest in terms of things like improving bone density only is true in very, very specific circumstances, which do not include going for a walk, even if that walk is on an incline. So the evidence is being misrepresented in order to sell a product. And, it doesn't make any sense financially for someone to then go back and say, hey, remember how I told everyone to get a weighted vest and now you all have one? Well, oopsies, actually the evidence isn't there, my bad. Like they're not going to do that, right? Because they have to remain the expert. And so those are a lot of signs. But I think my biggest one always is I look at what kind of doctor they are. So someone like Vonda Wright is an orthopedic surgeon. But now I see her doing ads for MIDI Health or Alloy, where she's talking about putting estradiol, right, a form of estrogen, on your face. There is zero evidence that putting it on your face is going to do anything. And also, there's no there's no, like, it's not FDA approved because a lot of wellness products don't require any sort of approval from any federal organization. So this very sort of like new, untested, unproven, potentially not a good idea, but she's telling me now to put this thing on my face, and I'm like, well, you're an orthopedic surgeon, so that's, to me, that's like an immediate red flag of like, this is a person who's stepped outside their scope. Why have they stepped outside their scope? It's hard for me to believe that it's out of the goodness of their heart, because they're stepping out of their scope into the wellness industry, typically, which is a lot of unproven products solving problems that you don't actually have. And one of the big things that I always like to stress is, a lot of people are like, oh, big pharma, blah, blah, blah. Big pharma is like a $1 billion industry. Wellness, which I think we should really just start calling it big wellness. Big wellness is a $1 trillion industry. And I always like to point out as well that the difference between $1 billion and $1 trillion, because sometimes I think we just start to hear big numbers and we don't really know the significance. So $1 trillion is 1,000 billions, right? So in terms of, it's like, if we marked it in time, if 1 billion was 30 seconds, $1 trillion is 30,000 seconds, right? So starting to understand the size of this huge unregulated industry, when you see someone who is a doctor, clinician, stepping into this industry, I can't believe that it's because they're really trying to help people, right? It just doesn't make sense. So it has to be for profit, and it has to be for boosting the brand. And one of the ways you continue to boost your brand is continuously bringing in new things that people supposedly need, right? So there's always going to be a new face cream, an updated, product for your whatever, right? And we made a post recently with Amanda Thebe where we did a joke product that we called estro paste, which is like estrogen toothpaste for your menopausal teeth. And what's hilarious about it is a few people thought it was a real thing. And they were like, what are you doing? Why are you? And we were like, dude, it's fully a joke. But that was our sort of parody, our satirization of this just super unregulated Wild West internet world where anyone can say quite literally anything to sell you something. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing how much this stuff does feel beyond parody, as your point as well. Is like there's almost nothing that's too ridiculous now. I think of this trend that started a few months ago with the AI generated, AI influencers, where you just have these sort of videos of an AI generated monk or an old Amish woman. They have a bunch of these different virtual influencers and they're all selling moringa or whatever. And just like trying to explain that to someone from 5 years ago wouldn't even make any sense, that like there are now fake influencers online who are peddling all these questionable things. You made a lot of good points there. And I'm going to ask, I guess, one quick question and then one question that's going to require a little more nuance. And there's a term you both use, and sometimes you'll call it a mechanistic theater or mechanism theater. And I think this is really interesting concept because it's something I've noticed as well. I remember, well, back in 2008 or so, I remember Gary Taubes when he was talking about the insulin hypothesis of obesity, and I remember memorizing, okay, so you take sugar and insulin goes up, and then your body's and like I memorized this whole thing that I thought actually meant something. I realized I was just memorizing a bunch of words. Very much knowing the word for something is not actually knowing the thing itself. And I think this is accelerated. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about what that is and why it's important for people to be aware of this.
Yeah. So a lot of people, someone like Stacey Sims is a good example, will get, well, a couple of things. One is they will get so deep into the mechanisms of the ways that your body, it might react, let's say, and that's in like heavy quotation marks, to a certain product or supplement or something like that. So, getting into the details of like what's happening in your hippocampus and what's happening in this part of your brain and how your cortisol levels are doing this and doing that, and sort of describing all of these mechanisms, naturally occurring mechanisms, but then problematizing them. So, for example, saying that like, your cortisol rises in the morning and this is one of her guidelines for women. You have to eat something within the first half an hour of waking up in order to balance like stop your cortisol from rising, which is just patently untrue because everyone's cortisol rises in the morning because you woke up, right? Your cortisol rises when you exercise because your body perceives it as a type of stress. When you stop exercising or when you eat something, your cortisol goes back down. So there's a lot of describing these mechanistic pathways of things that take place in your body naturally, but fear-mongering them, problematizing them, and then selling you some type of solution, whether it's a product or a course to learn how to do something or, whatever it may be. The other thing that we see is a lot of these mechanistic pathways are actually derived from research that is not in humans, which is also a problem. So a great example is rapamycin, which is something that a lot of people sell as a supposed longevity supplement. It has FDA approval as an immunosuppressant to prevent organ transplant rejection. Right? That's what it's used for in humans. This idea that it extends your lifespan and delays these like age-related diseases, that research is in yeast, rats, mice, and flies, right? There's no human research that proves that rapamycin in humans extends longevity. But we get into this mechanistic detail, right? We get into this, well, we're looking at the ways that it does that in yeast, flies, mice, and rats. And we're saying, well, surely that's how it happens. That's how it works for everything and everybody, including humans. Therefore, we're going to sell you on this mechanism because that's, longevity is this like really big hype word right now that everyone's trying to sell you things to extend your longevity, right? So that's a sort of classic example of taking research that's not on humans and, extending it to as if it would apply to humans, which it really, you can't. That's not a
And then I think similar but slightly different is just because something has FDA approval, that doesn't mean that it is effective. you know, uh, FDA is just saying, well, it's probably safe in this context. In no way are we saying that you should use that for gains. Yeah, it's funny, this trend of pathologizing everything, medicalizing everything, problematizing everything. That does seem to be one of those great narratives that we see, and it's been around forever. I know on the podcast you've talked about iatrogenesis before. And this idea of what potential harms can be caused by the over medicalizing, or applying a medical model to everything. And I think the balance there, and you always do a very good job of this, is obviously not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because I think whenever people hear a critique of a behavior of a doctor, obviously we're not criticizing doctors as a profession or medical science for the process of science. We're really talking about individuals and their behavior. And yeah, for me, I always think of that. I call it the supplement Rubicon, which is the moment a figure starts selling supplements, it's going to be very, very hard. Because if someone were being honest, any of these proprietary blends, like if we look at something, say like creatine is going to be made in one of the same labs around the world. And creatine is creatine. It's essentially a commodity at this point, where it's more or less interchangeable. So the moment someone puts a proprietary blend and they say, okay, well, we've got creatine, we mixed it with the optimal levels of this kind of collagen or whatever. It's like, okay, fine. You're doing this specifically. I feel like you're doing this specifically because you want to make money, because you could just as easily say, hey, you can buy this creatine monohydrate online and it's, it's like less than a cent per 15 milligrams. Um, the other question I want to ask, and I'm asking this because I know I've heard you have a good answer to this already. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. So people hear this, okay, well, and you even said it yourself. You see these people and they're going on online and they're selling courses. They're saying, hey, come to us for this, come to us for that. So how someone hears this idea, well, if people have a profit motive, you have to be a little bit skeptical, perhaps, about their positioning. But then, for example, I know that you do a course, you do several courses, but I know you have your barbell longevity course, which also uses the word longevity, and it's something Jill and I talk about all the time. I used to do public health, so we talk about health span a lot, which I always quite like. But then, in a few years, people are going to start using the word health span, and then all of a sudden, that's going to be the new buzzword. But can you kind of talk about, um, maybe why that's different, tie into scope of practice, and also your goals for sharing a course like that?
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, one of the things that sometimes people push back against us on is if we're online and we're saying, hey, this doctor that you think is your buddy is not your buddy, and they're selling you the supplement that you don't need, da da da. Sometimes people will argue back and they're like, you two are selling something. And it's absolutely true. We have an online course. It's called Lift for Longevity. The reason why we call it Lift for Longevity is that there are mountains of evidence, like literally mountains of evidence, showing that strength training can extend your lifespan, right? Or at the very least, make your life better, especially for women, and especially for women sort of menopausal age and older, who were never themselves encouraged to use a barbell, pick up something heavy, right? For women, the encouragement around exercise was always more sort of like cardiovascular work, because the supposed goal is to look a certain way, not to be able to do certain things, right? So when people push back, we say, yeah, we have a course. It's about lifting barbells. There's no proprietary anything. We're just teaching you how to do it, right? And we're teaching you how to do it for 6 months. And compared to, I mean, we don't think it's that expensive compared to like what it would be if you hired a personal trainer for 6 months, kind of thing. And so then this question of like, well, you're telling me to be suspicious of people selling things online, and yet you are selling things online. More the nuance of that is like, yes, people sell things online. Not everything that's being sold online is a bad idea. But Laurel and I are working 100% within our scope of practice, providing exercise education, essentially. So that's the difference, right? If I don't know. I mean, it's a bit of a stretch, but like, actually, no, so Vonda Wright, orthopedic surgeon, I actually kind of liked her initially because she was posting a lot of stuff about how women needed to lift weights. And she was posting a lot of stuff about like work on your balance. Here's some, exercises to do, all that kind of stuff. And I was like, well, the the sort of detail, the nuance, the individuality of the exercises, she's not talking about that. And so she's not like fully in scope, but as an orthopedic surgeon, this was sort of her angle. She was like, she did these videos where she was like coming out of the operating theater and being like, I just did a hip replacement on a, 60-year-old man and he should have been lifting more weights kind of thing. So it wasn't fully outside of her scope. But then she started telling me to put estrogen cream on my face. And that's where I was like, you know what? No. So as far as being able to determine if you're a consumer, like, is this a course I should take? Is this not a course I should take? Is this going to benefit me? Is this not going to benefit me? You really want to look at what are the majority of people saying? What is the majority of research showing you? And Jen Gunter, who's another great authority on sort of online content for menopausal women, she made a really good point the other day where she said, if this person is touting something that's really new, which is often what brands do because they're trying to keep you on the hook, right? Here's this next new thing. Very likely nobody else is selling it or nobody else reputable is selling it because it hasn't had sufficient research behind it yet. Research takes time. So if you're trying to evaluate if something is worth doing or not worth doing as a consumer, look at what other people are saying about this product or activity, right? Are other people saying women should not lift weights? Only the ones who are trying to sell you something else, right? Not the research, right? That's not what the research is saying. So you want to be evaluating sort of within that context. One of the things that I have seen as well a lot is people selling courses on how to become a menopause certified coach. A lot of our work is in that kind of age range. So it's sort of our specialty. A menopause certified coach is not anything as far as I know. And any sort of like coaching certification is a bit sus. So if you were like, oh, well, I want to get this menopause coaching certification so I can call myself a certified menopause coach and that will attract more people to work with me. That's what the person is hoping for, right? They're hoping that you're going to buy into this idea that you need some other, quote unquote specialty. And it sounds legit-ish, probably to the layperson, right? Oh, certified menopause coach. They're certified, right? But that's not like someone who is a medical doctor with years of experience specializing in women with menopause kind of thing. They're not even remotely close to each other. So things like, certain certifications or calling yourself a coach of something like that, or those types of courses that you could participate in online, I think very often don't have, it doesn't actually give you any sort of real credentialing that would separate you in a meaningful way. But it does give you a new title that you can call yourself, kind of thing. So I think that's something to sort of look out for as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a funny, we were talking about this off camera as well. The I don't know, the professional certification hamster wheel that we see in the fitness industry. And it's funny because it has different angles to it, doesn't it? For one thing, people hope that if they get extra letters after their name, an extra piece of paper, then lay people say, oh, so and so, whatever. I'll use a good example, like a CSCS or something like that. Someone will know the difference. And for the most part, people don't. Most people don't really know what the inside of the industry looks like. But then there's also that aspect of probably one of the most profitable segments in the fitness industry is selling to professionals. This idea of just getting one more certification, this and that. And then like I go back and forth on it because, I think I guess it's the thing about who it's for. Like if it helps someone who wants to help people and it gives them the confidence to put themselves out there, especially I think there are a lot of people who come into the fitness industry later, and I think they have lots of fears of what's the word I'm looking for? I might have to pause it for myself now. What am I thinking? People are yes, thank you, imposter syndrome. I think there's this fear of imposter syndrome. And I think it's all about the why that you're doing this. Because it's one of the things we talk about. Because we do try to get people to go out and start their own movement communities. But for us, it's the idea that, like, look, we're not trying to say that you're a movement coach. What we're saying is, if you want to go out and get some people in your neighborhood to start moving together, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. So if it gives people the confidence to say, hey, you know what, if I want to start moving around with my parents or my kids or some other families on the street and moving, then that's great. If getting a little bit of experience, but then it's the exact thing. And then I'll quote I'll quote friend of the show, Mike Boyle. He has this quote. I'm a pretty big Mike Boyle fan. I mean, we could get into that, but all in all, I think his legacy's been pretty good for me. You can push back on that. But he has this quote. It's like, you're not a bad coach for not knowing something. You're a bad coach for pretending that you know something that you don't. And I think that's it. Is sometimes where people hide behind the aegis of the certification. And I was a CrossFit coach for about 10 years, and you could see sometimes, you could always tell when someone didn't have a lot of confidence as a coach, because they'd always do that appeal to authority. And they say, well, I'm the coach. It's like, I'm the person that spent the $2,000 to get the 2-day course. So that makes me the expert. And it's like, well, I don't know, man. Like, I think if you have to hide behind that, then perhaps you're getting these certifications for the wrong reasons. One of the mottos that you have that I really like, going back to your previous question or your previous answer, was at the beginning of the podcast, correct me if I'm wrong, you say strong opinions lightly held, loosely held. Yeah. And I like that because it also nods, as you're saying, that science is a process. And if new information comes along, then if you're not, if you're not stuck behind a specific product or a specific supplement or something like that, if you're just trying to give people the best information possible, when that new study comes out that says, hey, you know what, maybe lifting at a slightly lower percentage or 1RM also has benefits for osteogenesis. Maybe we don't all have to be lifting at 85% or something like that. It's much easier to take the information. It's when you really, put your foot down. I think Adam Meekins was talking about this the other day. There's this sort of sunk cost fallacy of once you've jammed your flag into the ground saying this is what I stand for, it makes it very, very hard to say, okay, well, maybe I was exaggerating a little bit, maybe I was wrong. What I want to ask about next is, and you kind of touched on this where you're talking about this idea of always pathologizing things or just taking normal aspects of being a human being and getting older and trying to turn it into some medical issue. But it's just this issue of fear. Why do we see so much fear in the fitness industry? Fear of doing it wrong, fear of hurting yourself. One of the biggest ones is fear of not being optimal. It's like you have to be optimizing everything. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a few kind of places we can go with this. The first one is, especially in the internet, Instagram, social media world, posts that fearmonger do way better than posts that don't. So people who are selling you things have figured that out. I mean, it's also just like the cornerstone of all marketing, right? Do you have XYZ problem? Well, don't worry, because we have ABC solution, right? So, and that's no different in the world of fitness, right? And we see it not just to go back to your point about certifications. We see it in the way that people talk to the general population, but we also see it in the way that professionals sell certifications or courses or products to other professionals, because they'll say something like, sure, you want to train someone to lift heavy, but if they haven't, the one that we see a lot is like everyone needs to do this sort of like smaller Pilates type core stability stuff before they get into any kind of heavier lifting. And that's just patently untrue. But it's a really good way to scare a practitioner who maybe doesn't know better into thinking, well, shoot, I need to take this person's course and then I can go teach this thing that I actually want to teach, right? Then I'll be prepared. And it's a very easy fallacy to fall into. And I think that sometimes is why people end up taking like course after course after course, because there's always someone to tell you like, oh, wait, no. You also have to be able to do this thing before you can do that thing. And in terms of using fear in particular towards women, there's really, I mean, I used to sort of soft pedal this a little bit because I didn't want a podcast about movement and exercise to be overtly political and potentially turn people off for that reason. But considering the world that we're in currently, I don't think there's any reason to soft pedal this idea anymore. It's patriarchal. It is a means to control women, to make them afraid of becoming stronger, afraid of what becoming stronger will make their body look like, which is often wildly over exaggerated. This idea that you're going to become bulky and like bulky is a bad thing. Everybody who lifts knows how hard it is to actually get any bulk on your body. So the idea that you would like lift something heavy twice and suddenly look like the Hulk is not real, but it preys into this patriarchal fear that has been internalized by a lot of women, which is that their value is based on their appearance, and the value of their appearance will go down if it doesn't fit into this very specific, very narrow idea. And the idea that like if you don't maintain your appearance like this, you will become less valuable to the man that you are supposed to be attracting, because he is going to be your caretaker and caregiver, right, in this big scary world kind of thing. So it's a big mushed up mess in a lot of women's heads, I think. And I do see that some younger generational women are rejecting this idea. And in the gym, we're seeing more and more women lifting weights, not just getting on the machines, but using barbells. And I mean, it's still very much dominated by men, but there are more and more women in there. And the use of fear to keep women small is just a very simple tool and tactic. And there's also a lot of influencers out there who take that concept and repurpose it and sell it as something like, well, don't you want to be feminine? Don't you want to look like this? And just kind of play into these fears that a lot of women have. But I think the end of the day is like, whether you're a clinician or just a movement professional or some sort of influencer online, we know what actually makes a difference to your physical body, right? We know there's very clear, very well outlined information around types of exercise, how much to do. Even though the new, food triangle or whatever it is bananas, we do actually have a lot of evidence around what foods are healthy for you and you can eat a lot of, what foods you might want to limit or reduce or things like that. But it's very boring because it's just factual information. And people aren't interested in that. People are interested in some new way that they could potentially supersede all of that and just magically end up somewhere else, right? Looking like something else, having a certain, whatever their goal is. And so any sort of influencer understands that and therefore is going to lean into the fear of, right? It's the FOMO. It's the fear of missing out on this new thing that could actually change your life, right? And that's how they sell you stuff, right? What's the expression in news? It's like, if it bleeds, it leads, right? Right? We want the scary bad story because we want to then compare ourselves to it and be like, okay, I'm doing the right thing, right? And that plays again into that optimization idea, right? The idea that, it makes me mental. The idea that you have to be quote unquote optimizing every single moment of your day. Like you have to wake up at the right time and you have to drink your coffee at the right time. And there's some BS about you need to go outside and stare at the sun or something. And then they're like, do some forest bathing. I'm like, oh, you mean go for a walk? Like it's just, it's nonsense. But it's so easy to get caught up in it. And this idea of like, there's something I'm not doing, right? There's something more I need to be adding to my life. And that's going to make me feel better, live longer, get a girlfriend, make more money, right? It's sort of, we have this idea that it's just going to change our entire world. And again, it's just patently untrue.
Yeah, also this obsession with hacks, with body hacks and things like that, which is also tied to like, quantified self. Like so many of these things have coalesced. These have been trends that have been happening for a long time. A lot of them coming out of Silicon Valley, but other places, and it's just sort of it's all kind of accelerated on the internet at one time. And it's like it's funny because you see these things like something like forest bathing is a good example. I know people who are forest bathing practitioners, and they're very nice people, and the message is good. So often, like the kernel of the message is good, but exactly like you said, do we need to turn this into a product? Does someone need to become certified in forest bathing? I don't know the subtleties of that. And some of my friends are going to yell at me for that, but it's like that versus taking time and go in the woods. Maybe if you give something a name, it means people will value it more. So people are friction maxing now, which is this idea of making aspects of their life less efficient. Example would be getting rid of the smartphone and going back to an old Nokia or something like that as a way to slow things down. And while that's interesting, the fact that it's given a name and it's trending and people are talking about it on TikTok, it's like it's just it's an Ouroboros. Everything constantly eats itself, and it's interesting because Laurel was talking the same thing. It's something that I've thought about as well, is like how the fitness industry always preys on the anxieties of the time. It's always a reflection, ideas of femininity, ideas of masculinity, ideas of martial prowess, ideas of whatever sexual value and all these things. And as things become more and more quantified, and you even just like look at the culture of dating uh, on the dating apps, where you can say, I want someone who's exactly 6'2", who's this age, who's into that. Once everything becomes quantified, it's just so much more room for these anxieties to magnify. And there's this quote, I'm going to get it wrong. It's an apocryphal quote from Margaret Thatcher, who's a right leaning prime minister in the UK, and she says, what did she say? It's like, my greatest accomplishment was Tony Blair. And what she essentially means, and this is way too political for this show, but I'll just keep on going. She's saying, my greatest accomplishment is that, a labor prime minister could come around a few years later and espouse all these beliefs about free market capitalism and things like that, which means that she shifted the whole window over so much that she sort of controlled the narrative. And I was thinking about this the other day because I was listening to another podcast, and they're saying, it's what's interesting about modern online culture, and whether you want to call it neoliberalism or whatever, late stage capitalism, is that all these anxieties that used to be unique to women now we're starting to see in men as well. And I'm not saying it's the same thing. I'm not going to equivocate. That's not what I'm trying to say. But it's interesting all of a sudden, this idea of, plastic surgery and weight loss and these peptides and all these things, where in the past it's just like guys just wanted to be big, but now all of a sudden you're seeing guys getting these jaw surgeries and eyelid surgeries and all these different things. And it's a shame because, things are almost not quite equalizing, but sort of in the wrong direction on certain trends. And it's one of the things I always defend CrossFit about, is that CrossFit, if nothing else, it did make it okay, to feel good and be strong and powerful as a woman, in a way that I think was hard, in the way that it popularized Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting and strong women competitions and things like that. I think one of its long lasting benefits will be that even if it was all marketing up to a point, it did kind of create the space where women could feel good about being strong and powerful and capable. But the pendulum always swings back and forth, and I guess the issue with social media is it's just everything all the time now. There's sort of enough space and enough money to sort of prey on any anxiety that people have, and just to really go down that rabbit hole. I want to switch gears, if you don't mind. Um, I do, and you mentioned it before. You were talking about the group, the menopause, or maybe we can talk about the menopause industry. And just in the way that I think people have found that there's opportunities to make money off of anything now, same as it's ever been. Suddenly, after perhaps years of being invisible, menopausal, perimenopausal, postmenopausal women are suddenly seen as a viable, uh, I don't know, marketing niche. So we have seen this explosion in this conversation around menopause. So I'd kind of like for you to talk about your thoughts on that. But then what I'd like to do is I'd like to start segueing into talking about osteoporosis and training with osteoporosis.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, the what we've seen happen over the past probably 10 years or so is that there were initially a very few voices calling for more attention for women during menopause, calling out the fact that a lot of women's health doctors or even their primary care physicians were ignoring their needs, ignoring their symptoms, brushing them off. Women were not being heard. Historically, women are not heard, right? So initially, and this was people like Mary Claire Haver and Fonda Wright, right? Initially, people were bringing more attention to this large group of women, and the sort of early followers were so grateful for it, obviously, and I am grateful for that aspect of it, because we are seeing so much more conversation and discussion around this than we ever have in the past. But very quickly, what that sort of like backslid into was, oh shoot, this is a whole segment of the population that is old enough to have probably made some money by now. Kids are probably out of the house or no longer a major financial suck on their lives, right? So they potentially have some disposable income. And not only can we sell them stuff, we can go so granularly into all the different problems that they may be having and give you, for example, really mechanistic answers and with a product to buy at the end, or give you just completely nonsensical word salad answers like cortisol is causing your menopause belly or things like that, right? Which sound scientific and draw people in. And, just because we're older, hopefully a lot of women who, as they grow older, become less concerned about their appearance. But I think coupled with now this sort of like rise of the popularity of Ozempic, and we're seeing a lot of celebrities suddenly being extremely skinny. I think a lot of women my age are kind of getting re-triggered with this concern about their appearance, and so that's frustrating. One of the things that we are seeing a lot is this understanding that menopausal women, sort of during or post-menopause, or really before that, but that if you haven't been lifting weights, you really need to start. And I think a lot of women do understand that sort of broadly, whether or not they're actually doing it. One of the things that Laurel and I did was, and this goes back to this ability to, like, when the new evidence comes along, change your mind a little, right? Or talk about it. So our barbell course, Lift for Longevity, when we started it, the research that we were looking at really highlighted the need for heavy weightlifting. And that was also sort of in the zeitgeist at the time. And then further evidence kind of became apparent that actually, no, you could do moderate weightlifting and potentially even light weightlifting, although you would have to get to like a really high number of repetitions, because the important part is that you're always going really close, not going to failure, but getting really close to failure. We went out and did an entire podcast episode, an entire post on our page about how, hey, we used to say heavy only, but now we're realizing this, heavy and moderate, But the one of the reasons that was originally given for lifting heavy weights was to reduce your risk of osteoporosis or osteopenia, and actually potentially reverse it. And we have had some women in the course who have successfully stopped the decline of their bone density. Some of them have actually turned it around and moved themselves out of osteoporosis categorization to osteopenia categorization, or even like normal bone density. So we do know that that is a method that works. But again, the messaging that a lot of women are getting, and a lot of this visual messaging that women my age are getting, is like, actually, no, right? You still need to be skinny. You still need to look skinny, which then obviously just kind of gets in the way of understanding the fact that no, lifting weights is going to be materially important to your bones. With that said, there are people for whom not much intervention works because there is a genetic component to osteoporosis. And I've known people who've done a bunch of weightlifting in the attempt to reverse their osteoporosis, and it hasn't been successful. And they've had to go, down other pathways. But it certainly doesn't hurt you to get really strong. And certainly at this sort of like, midlife, possibly 2/3 of the way through your life time period, when your muscle mass is decreasing, where your power output is decreasing, where, all these things are sort of like on the decline. It's never a bad idea to get really strong. And a lot of the issue with I can just like start talking more about osteoporosis and T-scores and things like that. So, while engaging in heavy lifting can improve that T-score, right? The T-score is the scale that they use to determine what counts as normal, what counts as osteopenia, which is like the osteoporosis precursor, and what counts as osteoporosis. What we see, what I see clinically in terms of women with osteoporosis is a very different group than what we see sort of in the fitness world, which is maybe you generally have been quite healthy, but out of the blue, suddenly you got an osteopenia diagnosis and it's freaking you out. And maybe if we look at your movement history, you've been really focusing on a lot of cardiovascular exercise and not a lot of strength exercise. And it wouldn't be a bad idea to start to include the strength exercise kind of thing. And especially in that case in particular, yes, the bone density is an issue, but the biggest issue is the falls risk, right? And whether or not you are likely to fall and break something. Because the scary statistic is if you're later in life, if you fall and let's say you break your hip and you are hospitalized, something like 20% of those people die in the hospital. And so that's a really scary number. And a lot of the time what that ends up doing to people is rather than going out and doing something proactive about it, they just make the challenges in their life smaller. So they don't go walk on a road that's uneven. They don't go on a big, long, hike where they might trip on something. There's a lot of that kind of behavior, which then again is that Ouroboros where it's just going to make everything worse, right? Clinically speaking, if I see someone and the information that I have about them before I see them is like their T-score is like 4.1 or something like that. That's a very, very low score, right? That's someone who has pretty severe osteoporosis. So my approach to that person is going to be way different than my approach to the person who's like 55 and suddenly I'm not sure why their bones aren't as strong as they used to be kind of thing. Typically the person with a very high osteoporosis score, or very low rather, also has a bunch of other co-conditions. They're typically very frail. They may have some sort of cardiovascular or other systemic disease going on. They, so an approach to them, first of all, that's someone who needs to be seeing a clinician. But my approach to them is much less about let's get you lifting heavy weights, and it's much more about let's start to make you unafraid of moving, because a lot of women in particular in that position have just become terrified to do anything. And let's gradually get you to a place where we might be not even necessarily trying to improve your bone density, but trying to improve your fall risk. And there's actually a really good tool called the FRAX tool online. I don't know if you've heard of it. FARX. And you literally, if you just Google FRAX, it's a score that determines your fall risk, your fracture risk. And so, yes, it'll look at your T-score if you have it, but it also looks at things like, are you a smoker? Is there a history of, were your parents smokers? Do you take steroids? Have you been taking steroids for a long time? A lot of lifestyle components that then make up a much bigger picture around whether or not you yourself are likely to fracture. So, I hope, because I think what happens is a lot of women who are sort of in that first category of generally healthy, but suddenly have a low T-score, tend to think of themselves as at risk of hurting themselves as the kind of second clinical, extremely low score category that I'm talking about. There's not a lot of kind of understanding that like there's osteoporosis and then there's osteoporosis kind of thing. And our course was originally called Bone Density Course Lift for Longevity. We removed the bone density course of our name, not because the evidence showed anything different, but because we were really also wanting to include people who were just interested in getting stronger, not necessarily trying to fight their bone density concerns. But lifting weights, is a again, as I said, like proven by mountains of research way to not just get stronger, but it actually improves your balance. Strength can have positive impacts on your power output. And power is not just like we tend to think of things like people doing what's it called? Depth jumps. What's it called? When you
Yeah,
jump off a box and then you jump again.
yeah, like the plyometric rebound.
Yeah, like this
Yeah,
really
the
intense.
depth drops. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly.
People tend to think about that as far as what power output might be. But in realistic terms, it's the ability to, like, let's say you trip, how fast can you get your other foot out in front of you to put it down so you don't fall? That's actually a power exercise. And so those types of things, in a lot of ways, working on strength, working on power, are probably going to benefit you more than something like practicing a single leg balance or doing, quote unquote balance exercises. There's a lot of research around how strength training has this positive impact on not just your muscular strength, but a lot of other aspects of your physical capability. So that's what I have to say about osteoporosis.
That's great. I want to be mindful of your time because I need to get out of here. So I think that's a great place to end. So, Dr. Sarah Court, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely talking to you.
It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
Okay, so that was my interview with Dr. Sarah Court, physiotherapist. I really, really enjoyed that episode, and I hope you did as well. I think we really covered a lot there. Obviously talking about barriers, preventing women from engaging in strength training. I think that's always important to talk about. I also just really like the conversation about fear around the fitness industry and how often, especially in social media, people can be rewarded by spreading messages of fear as opposed to more empowering messages, which is, one of the things we really try to think about a lot at Wild Strong. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast, please try to leave us a good review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you have the time, leave a nice comment as well. I don't think the comments make much of a difference in terms of ranking, but it's just really nice to hear people say what they like about the podcast. And, if you ever have a good idea for a guest or something, please send that our way as well. We'd be very happy to speak with them and see whether or not they'd be a good match for the podcast. All right. Take care.